and thank you to the wonderful organizers of this conference. I also do conference organizing, and you all have done an amazing job, especially being your first year. So just a quick show of hands. Who here has heard of or used Read the Docs? Okay, so like 50%. Who here has heard of Write the Docs? It's like 30%. Okay, cool. So what are these things? Why am I here? So I created both of these things over the years, and this talk is really going to go through kind of the act of the creation and kind of the history of Python and documentation, and then kind of where we are currently in 2016, and then some of the views that I have for the future of docs going forward from here. So Read the Docs is a documentation hosting platform used heavily in the Python world, but also used outside of Python. This is the big, shiny slide of stats. My favorite one there is that we've done 400 million page views of documentation in the last 5 years. And we're now up to about 20 million page views a month. That is really kind of crazy to think about. And so here's a graph of the line. Like all good graphs, it goes up and to the right. But yeah, it's really crazy. You can see here kind of when it started, like all projects, nobody used it, and just through kind of perseverance, it really became something that the Python community and the programming community in general has really come to depend and use a lot. So if you're a Python developer, these are a few of the projects that we host. You almost certainly use them every day. If you're not a Python person, we also host lots of other documentation for different languages. Lots of JavaScript, lots of PHP, ASP.NET, actually the new version is documented using Read the Docs. So it's really spread beyond the Python world, but it started as a Python project. It's written in Django, and it really is kind of the core of that world is Python. And so after a few years doing Read the Docs, we also created Write the Docs, which is our conference. And so this is a picture of a room of over 300 people sitting in Portland, Oregon, talking about software documentation. Like, let that sink in for a minute, that this room exists somewhere in the world. And like, yes, this is like a real thing that people care about and takes skill and has an entire industry around it of technical writers. And really, when I was doing Read the Docs, I kind of discovered documentation as a programmer. But Write the Docs has really allowed me to see documentation as kind of where it fits into the entire tech industry as a whole. And that's with, writers, technical writers, developers, support people, designers, managements, right? Like, everybody has a different view and a different kind of thing they care about in regards to documentation. And so that's really kind of helped me get that worldview. And this is about 150 people that you cannot see at all. You can see the background, which is a castle, because it was in Prague. So this is our European event. So we also have, 150 to 200 people to get together to talk about documentation in Europe. And then we also do meetups, similar to the DR. I know you all have a really amazing, flourishing meetup community here. We have 13 meetups on 2 continents. None that are Spanish-speaking yet, but maybe somebody at the end of this talk will be inspired to really, start something around documentation down here in the Caribbean or South America. All right, so I like to start these talks by thinking about, what is the value of documentation? As a developer, like, why should you be doing this? If you already believe documentation is a good idea, these will help you convince other people. You might have to justify to your management or someone else in your organization that writing documentation is important. And if you as a programmer don't think so, hopefully I can convince you. And so my favorite appeal is a selfish one. Have you ever kind of done a code review and you're like doing the git blame and you're like, please, please, not me, not me, not me, not me. Like, you don't know if you wrote code that's in your code base after 6 to 12 months, right? Like, the code you wrote 6 months ago is indistinguishable from code someone else wrote 6 months ago. And the act of programming is really kind of loading the whole concept of a program into your head and then writing code with that state. And if you don't write documentation, whether it's a design document for your piece of code, a comment, being like, this is this clever thing I did and here's why. If you don't put that down when it's in your head onto paper, you're never going to remember what you were doing, 6 months or a year later. So actually writing things down while you're thinking about them is incredibly important, and that's one of the best uses of documentation as a programmer. Documentation is also fantastic marketing, right? Like, if you go to a GitHub repo and there's no README, like, what is the chance you're ever going to use that code? Nobody uses that code. You're just like, well, this doesn't matter, right? Like, documentation is super, super important to actually have people use your code. In open source communities, this is great for, how to install it, how to get started, what problem does it solve? Like, is it actually solving the problem that you need to be solved so that I know I can kind of use that code to do this? But something people don't think about is it's also super important within organizations and corporations, writing proprietary code. If, there's so many times within companies where like 3 different teams are building the same code, or you fix something and nobody knows you fixed it because there was no kind of communication of the work that you did. So documentation within companies is super important as well to actually build kind of local standards and libraries that are used within companies. So writing documentation also makes your code better. A lot of times I see this talked about as documentation-driven development. And so one of the things I really like doing is before I'm going to start like a little project, or say you're writing like a Flask API, is to go in and be like, all right, here's the kind of README that I would have on this project when it's done. And here's like the example code, here's like the example API, request and response, and here's kind of what the user experience of using the software looks like before I actually build the software. Because I know personally, if I just go and kind of start building things without thinking about the final result, the kind of implementation details of the code end up kind of making their way into the user experience, and it doesn't actually, fit the mental model of the user at the end of the day. So thinking about kind of how the code is going to be used by the user before you start writing it, and like writing that down with words, is a really, really good way to actually improve the design of the software that you create. One of the other big ones is writing documentation helps you become a better writer. Who here in this room kind of identifies writing as a major part of the job that they do? Okay, so about 30%. You write GitHub issues, you write emails, you write commit messages, you write documentation, you write tweets, you write blog posts. Like, if you work remotely, or even if you work at a company, the majority of the communication that you do within your organization is using the written word. So being a good writer is integral to being a good programmer. Being able to communicate your ideas so that code is written properly, so that you can argue for the way that you think things should be designed. Like, these are super, super, super important things as a programmer that you need to be able to do. And so writing documentation and just becoming a better writer about technical topics is an incredibly important thing to do as just being a developer, like regardless of any other considerations. All right, so hopefully you now believe me that documentation is important. And so I'd like to go back kind of in time in the Python world so people get kind of a little bit of an idea of where the Python documentation culture came from. So I find technology moves really fast, and people tend to only look forward. They're like, oh, new fancy software, new fancy thing, new fancy database. And nobody really kind of thinks about how the stuff that we have and we appreciate came to be, right? Like, the Python community has amazing documentation. It's one of the best documented software kind of communities that I've seen. And so how did this happen, right? Like, how did we get to that point where we have amazing documentation for all the tools that we use? So 10 years ago, the Python documentation was written in Perl. All right, not really. So it was written in LaTeX, which, if you're in the science world, is a great way to do math stuff, but is not a great way to document software. And then that LaTeX was kind of like munged together with a bunch of Perl scripts to generate the Python documentation website, which very much looks like, 10 years ago. And so the Python community just kind of had this tool. It was written in Perl and LaTeX, and it was available for anyone to use, but nobody in the community actually used it because why would you use it? And it's really hard, right? There was no standardization. Everybody was just kind of writing HTML or just kind of putting random stuff up on the web. And so this is an example of what that kind of LaTeX looks like, right? I'm sure the science people in the room were like, that's beautiful. And the programmers were like, that's line noise. And we're both kind of right. So anyway, this is kind of the state of the art 10 years ago. So then 2 years after that, someone came along and was like, all right, like, we need a better solution to this problem. We should be documenting Python, with Python, but also LaTeX is not the correct solution. And so Jorg Brandl posted on the mailing list for Python Dev. It's just like, hey, I spent a few weeks and kind of like hacked together some stuff that uses restructured text, which was something that had been kind of developed in parallel. That was a nice way, similar to Markdown, of doing plain text markup that turned into something nice like HTML. And then that kind of was formed to do Python's core documentation, but then it was also released as an independent project, which was called SPHINX'S. So SPHINX'S was released in July of 2007. And so if you view the Python 2 documentation, this theme I'm sure will be very familiar to you. This is kind of the default SPHINX'S theme that it shipped with. And so this took kind of that LaTeX that that Python was documented in and turned it into restructured text. So this is a much more readable and nice example of the markup that we're pretty much used to today. So kind of what was SPHINX'S doing differently? Like what was the reason that it was created for? And one of the big ones is that files should be readable as plain text, right? Like we're programmers, we're using text files, we're using version control. Like we should be working in things that are very, very useful as plain text. They should render nicely into HTML or PDFs, but the primary way that we're interacting with them are as plain text, and that should be a primary consideration for the design. And one of the big ones is that the docs should be easy to contribute to, right? Like having them be in plain text in something that's kind of parsable as a human makes them much easier to contribute to. And one of the big ones here is that the markup language should be extensible. So this means that restructured text, you can extend it within Python by doing extensions in code, but you can also extend the actual markup language that it uses to do kind of new types of things in the markup. So I'm going to spare most of you my rant against Markdown, which is very entertaining, and come talk to me in person if you want to hear it. But this is the one slide, So in Markdown, there's no concept of anything that's extendable. So if you want to do a link to PEP8, for example, you just do a link with the title PEP8, and you put a target in it. But with restructured text, it gives you this extensibility thing, and so you can just say, this is basically kind of as Brandon was talking about, you're calling a function here, right? So the function is called PEP, and the argument is 8. And so you can write your own functions, you can write your own things to kind of automatically generate documentation. And so the really cool thing about this, right, is when the Python website got updated, you could go back in and just change this one function, and every single link that it generated would get migrated to the new URL structure. Whereas if you just have a bunch of random links lying around your code base, like there's nothing you can do with those. And so it gave you this really, really powerful kind of extensible structure to actually write your documentation in. All right, so that was why SPHINX'S was created about 7 or 8 years ago. And so 5 years ago is where kind of I come into this picture, and I saw that kind of SPHINX'S was slowly emerging as a standard within the Python community for doing documentation. But everyone was kind of agreeing it was a great way to document software, but there was no way to kind of host it or manage it or really think about how to do, the hard stuff with documentation of kind of keeping it up to date. And so we created Read the Docs to solve this problem in 2008. No, 2010, sorry, 5 years ago. And so we released Read the Docs, which was the hosting platform, to really help to kind of standardize how to also host and manage your documentation once you've written it using SPHINX'S. And so Read the Docs kind of took SPHINX'S and then added another layer on top of kind of ways that we see the world. And the big one here is documentation should live in version control, right? Like it's plain text. It has these wonderful things. It works with diffs. has all the same properties as code, and so it should live right next to your software, in a docs directory, and that's where your documentation should live. And this should then work kind of from there with the same programming tools, right? Documentation should work like continuous integration. You should always, every time you commit a new change to your docs, it should automatically be updated, on your website. There used to be issues, where you'd want to use a piece of software and either, you're using a version that was released, a year ago, and their documentation has since moved on, and they only have their kind of latest release documented. Or there's the opposite, right, where you're on the latest commit of that piece of code, but then the documentation they have online is from like 3 months ago, and nobody ever updated it. So we really tried to take how you do development with version control and map that to documentation, right? So there's always, your master branch, which is latest and up to date, but then you can also use other branches, with versions that are also hosted and released at the same time. So that's kind of how we looked to solve the problem of, out of date and always up to date documentation. And the nice thing that kind of falls out from that is that now within software shops, documentation can be treated just like code and tests. So this is something that Django's done for a long time, and it's one of the big reasons that its documentation is so good. Like a feature will not be merged in Django without documentation and tests for that feature. And you can enforce this at the code review level, right? Like if you're using documentation in a wiki and you're like working on a feature, you're like, all right, let's just merge the feature and we'll write the documentation tomorrow, or we'll write the documentation later. And then that never happens, right? And everything gets out of sync. But being able to kind of treat your documentation and code and tests as one chunk that's code reviewed and accepted and managed in the exact same way as software is the proper way to do this as developers. And so what we were really trying to do was just improve the amount, or improve the quality and the amount of documentation in the world. And to do this, to encourage people to do something, you need to make it as easy as possible. So it's like, all right, you're writing a Python app. This is the standard tool to document it with SPHINX'S. The standard way to host it and manage it is read the docs. And there's this obvious path that you go and, you don't have to stop and think. You're like, oh, what do I do? How do I write it? Where do I put it? How do I deal with it? And so like removing every step along the way where people get stuck or stop or, change to Reddit and look at something else, that's going to increase the amount of documentation in the world. And I have no way to actually measure this, but I'd like to think that it's been successful. Just with the amount of usage the read the docs has had, I hope that there is more documentation in the world because of that. And so read the docs is starting to kind of become pretty popular in the Python community, but there was no actual kind of community around the software, right? Like we're like, oh, we're building all this documentation, we're doing all this cool stuff, but there's no group of people who are talking to about it. There's nothing, you go to a Python conference. I think PyCon last year, there were 0 documentation talks, like at PyCon North America. At this conference, other than my keynote, there were no submitted talks. They were about documentation, right? Like, there's no place for us to go to really talk about this stuff. And so that's why we created Write the Docs, which was originally going to be just a kind of user group for Read the Docs users, but it quickly grew into something much bigger than that. And one of the really fascinating things is about 3 years ago, I was very much doing documentation in the context of a developer. Like, this is something that helps me do code, and it's something that I care about to help me kind of write software. And doing the conference, as I said earlier, really gave me this kind of much greater view of documentation. Like, there's an entire industry of tech writers. There's an entire industry of people that do translation of documentation. There's an entire industry of support people who write documentation as part of their job. And developers are almost universally regarded as being incredibly unhelpful. Right? Like most of these people really dislike dealing with developers because they don't care about documentation and they're not helping them achieve these tasks, right? And that's something that we're really trying to hope to change, is to have developers, caring more and more about documentation. So the Write the Docs worldview, kind of as summarized, documentation needs to be treated and valued much the same way as code in the software industry, right? Like, every one of us reads documentation every day. But every one of us definitely does not write documentation every day. And that's a huge, huge disparity. And when we don't write documentation, in open source, that mostly comes back on us as support people. But in our jobs, that comes back to other parts of the organization, right? As a developer, if you have crappy API docs, you never see that. The support team is over here dealing with that, and you never actually feel that pain, which is really part of the problem with that. And so we need a community of people who advocate and care about documentation. And that's what we're trying to build with Write the Docs, is like, there needs to be a professional group and a kind of a voice of this worldview. And previously, there was nobody there, right? Like, if there was bad documentation or you had thoughts about this kind of stuff, there was nowhere that you could go to talk about it or to find people to care about it. And one of the big ones is we need standards and best practices. And so this is where we're kind of turning into, where things are now. Like, as Python developers, we have really good tools for writing documentation, but we still have almost no best practices for actually how to write that documentation, right? Like, information architecture, style guides, all this kind of stuff, pretty much doesn't exist. And we look for examples on the internet and try and find a few good things here and there. But we really do need to start creating, these best practices around how to do documentation well. And that's another part where it'll be easier to start once you have that. And so one of the other things is that documentation is a fundamental part of teaching and learning programming. And actually, when I was just getting started learning Django, I was going on a vacation for Thanksgiving when I was in university, and I actually downloaded the entire Django documentation as a PDF, and I put it on my computer, and I went on this awful family road trip. And back then, the Django docs were only 300 pages, but that's pretty much how I learned Django. Was in this week-long thing where I'm just ignoring my family and trying to learn programming. But if that documentation didn't exist, I probably would not be a Django developer, right? That was the hook that really got me into that community and into that kind of programming world. And I think this is something that we don't think about, is that documentation is super important when you're learning how to code. So, you have Django girls who have this amazing tutorial, but then at the end of the day, when they're done with their workshop, they're out in the big bad world of programming. And if you run into a project and you want to use it and there's no documentation, there's no tutorial, there's no kind of way to get started, the people that are excited about programming are just going to hit a wall. And they're going to be stopped, right? Getting people into this profession, documenting stuff, is incredibly important. And lowering that barrier leads to more diverse types of people becoming programmers, right? Having good documentation is incredibly important for all sorts of outreach and all sorts of diversity efforts, right? The harder you make something, the more, A-type personality you have to really get through and do that work. And the best way that I found to kind of conceptualize this is that, do you really want a community full of people who don't read documentation? What does that look like, right? What is that type of community? It's we only read source code. We don't help other people use our software. I had this awful experience trying to learn the Linux kernel, and everybody else is going to have to do that too. This is not the type of communities that we want to be part of. And I firmly believe that one of the reasons that the Python community is so diverse and so welcoming and so accepting is that documentation culture has allowed hard-headed people that are going to fight through to become members, right? Everyone is welcome in the Python community. And a big part of that is because they're able to actually join and become members through the documentation that we provide. All right. So that has hopefully given you some context to where we are today, right? We have an amazing group of PyCons all around the world. We're one of the best documented software communities. And that's really kind of the meat of the presentation. But I also want to talk about some of the things I see kind of as the present state of things, and then also because, you know, it's a keynote, I'm going to bullshit a little bit about the future. And I keep saying this, but I really want to kind of emphasize that the Python community has excellent documentation. And this is a huge, huge advantage, right? Like, Python is also becoming the #1 teaching language in the world. Part of that is because of the design, as Brandon talked about, but also part of that is because once you actually take the intro course, you can start using the software. You have tutorials, you have introductions, you have Django girls, you have all of this support in terms of documentation to kind of keep you going. But I do see that kind of documentation is something that the Python community has started to take for granted, right? Nobody talks about it, except to me. Like, there's no talks at PyCon. I think this year there's 1 or 2 because I was really mad on Twitter about it last year. And I was like, hey, Python, you're screwing this up. Like, you have this amazing advantage as a community, and you're not maintaining it. You're not pushing it forward. You're not continuing to work on it. There's very few tools. You know, SPHINX'S and Read the Docs have maybe 10 contributors, like, combined, working on these tools that everyone uses, right? Like, that's crazy. And we really need to think about this, right? Like, how much time are we spending reading documentation? How much time are we spending writing documentation? And how much time are we actually spending investing and improving in kind of the tools and the infrastructure and the ability to actually continue this culture moving forward? And then another part that is particularly relevant is our translation of our documentation is incredibly bad. I'm sure I don't have to tell a lot of you this. Being a native Spanish speaker, it's probably pretty obvious. As far as I know, Python has no official translations of its documentation. I think there's some third-party efforts, but when you go to python.org, there's no links of Python documentation in other languages. Django has no official links of Django documentation in other languages. This is something that we really, really need to work on. And I don't exactly know how to do it. But I think there's not a lot of knowledge in our communities of how to build software with translation in mind, how to do release processes that account for string translation, all this kind of stuff. Like, there's a huge body of knowledge that I don't think exists widely in the Python community. So, read the docs, we have a very, a God's eye view in terms of who uses these tools. And 40% of requests that come to read the docs have something that's not English as their preferred language. But of those, 40% of those requests are served documentation in English, right? So one of the cool stats that I saw is that read the docs gets traffic from every continent, or every country in the world, every month. And all those people don't speak English, right? You shouldn't have to learn how to program and learn how to speak English at the same time. And documentation, I agree. A lot of people have different views of translation, but we should at least be translating, tutorials and topical guides and kind of introductory material. I know it's a huge amount of work, but just those kind of footholds to get people started in these projects should be much more accessible, around the world. And then, on a happier note, I do believe documentation has slowly started to make a shift in the programming world as a whole. I do a thing whenever I see a new piece of software on Hacker News. I click their website, and it's 95% of those projects have a documentation link, right? Maybe 5 years ago, that was 75 or 80%. Documentation is being seen as something that's, required to release a piece of software in the world. And that used to be true of the Python community for a long time, but I think the more general programming community is very much starting to come around to that worldview. So that's a really good thing. All right. So for the future. So this is one I talk to people all the time. So Markdown tried to create a standard that then the creator of Markdown said he couldn't use the name, or they couldn't use the name, or the whole kerfluffle, and then they ended up with common margin, which is the only version of Markdown that actually has a spec and has like a standard implementation. And soon they're actually going to work on an extensibility syntax for Markdown. So you'll actually be able to do that kind of function call type writing within Markdown. And once that happens, we really hope to actually build support for that into SPHINX'S, into Read the Docs, as a first-class citizen. Like, it shouldn't be something that is kind of on the side and partially broken because of the design. And so I really hope that that spec will actually come to pass, and there will be a standard way to extend Markdown so that we don't have 7,000 different incompatible versions all spread around the internet. So this one's actually pretty easy to forecast because right now when you generate Python documentation using SPHINX'S, it actually imports the project into memory and then pulls all of the doc strings off all your functions and classes and then outputs them. Which sounds great, except that means, especially if you're a scientific Python developer, you need the entire kind of build chain for that project just to be able to generate documentation, which seems crazy, right? Like you have this 500-line library and you need 2 gigs of C dependencies with NumPy and SciPy and all this stuff just to generate documentation. Like that, it's really annoying in terms of running a service that does this. But it just makes no sense, right? Like that's a huge waste of resources. And so we actually got a grant from Mozilla to build this using their MOST program. So now, within about 6 months, we should be able to automatically generate documentation from Python code without importing it, which is going to be awesome if you do anything that requires C libraries. So I'm really excited about that one. Better translation infrastructure. This is something I really want to work on, so I would love if there's people here that are kind of interested in translating things. Trying to figure out, I know there's Django core and Python core people here, just trying to get together and talking about how do we do translation well. I know there's some efforts around translating Django's and Python's documentation, but how do we actually turn those into something that's real and integrated into the design, into the development process of the projects and all this kind of stuff. So that's something that I think, especially in the Spanish-speaking world, would be incredibly valuable for just getting more people involved in Python. So automated testing and validation is another really interesting aspect. Because I don't know if folks remember, but about 6 or 7 years ago, tests were in a very similar place to where documentation is now. They were kind of seen as this nice-to-have thing that some people did, but wasn't really super important. And now testing is kind of viewed as a fundamental part of software development. And I think my best theory for why this happened is continuous integration made testing valuable, right? Before things like Travis and Jenkins, you would write tests, and then nobody would run them, and then the test would break, and then nobody would run them, and then you kind of ended up with this test suite that was worthless and nobody cared about. So all the effort that you put into writing tests was worthless, right? There was a negative return on that time. When continuous integration came around, it made testing a lot more valuable because you could write tests and then they were automatically run on every commit. And then as long as your culture says, if you break the build, you fix the tests, then tests eventually become more and more valuable over time. And they become, they have a positive feedback loop that's valuable for your company. And I think a lot of companies and projects now have a negative feedback loop with documentation. They write documentation, nobody reads it, it goes out of date, nobody reads it, and then the time spent writing the documentation was not worth it. And so I do think there's room in the world for automated testing and validation of documentation. So basically saying, oh, hey, you changed this code 20% and your docs didn't update at all. Or, hey, SPHINX'S actually supports this, but you can actually test the code examples in your documentation against the latest release of your software. So you're like, oh, these code examples are validated, they're working, we can prove this with a test suite. But then there's no way as a user to know that those code examples were tested, right? So I think we need to do a lot more around kind of proving and then helping documentation be correct and up to date so that it's more valuable and users start trusting it more. Because that's a super important problem. Like if nobody reads the documentation you're writing, then it doesn't matter that you wrote it, right? If their default reaction is just to like get on Slack and message you, it doesn't matter what you wrote down. And this is another one that I would really love to see the Python community working on. I mentioned it in kind of the write the docs context, but I think the Python community in particular, we have tools like Cookie Cutter, we have PEP8, we have all these kind of standardization things that we already do. And I would love to see something around that for documentation, right? Like, here is a standard template for a Python project. You can just put your name in and it generates an entire kind of scaffolding for your documentation. That kind of stuff is another way of kind of removing barriers, right? Like, I don't even have to think about the structure of my docs. I can just, push a button and it builds out all of the files and I just go in and start writing. One of the things that is really interesting is that people outside of Python and even outside of the programming world are starting to use the tools that we built in the Python community, right? Like at our conferences and this kind of stuff, you never see anyone using tools from like Java or C# or any of this kind of stuff, right? Like they're using Read the Docs, they're using SPHINX'S, they're using Jekyll, and more people are starting to kind of think about documentation in terms of using tools that programmers are working on. So there's an entire other world of like XML and IDEs and really terrifying stuff that is like the old way of doing documentation at like the enterprise level, right? All of those things are starting to be, replaced by tools that programmers are using. And we need to help those people, with that onboarding. And I see documentation becoming a first-class citizen in all software shops. I'm seeing it more and more in the open source world. I'm seeing it more and more in the corporate world. And I think over time, it's just going to keep kind of progressing, and the world is going to see the value of documentation more and more until it becomes, something that at every company people expect to have along with tests and code. So, to recap, Python has uniquely good documentation tools and culture around it. Like no other language community has this history of building these amazing tools that are, world-class around documentation. But we need to continue to invest in those tools and in that culture to make sure that Python stays the best documented programming language, and that we continue to push that forward to allow more people into our language community. And being a writer makes you a better developer. So it's something you should practice more. And you never know who might benefit from the documentation you write. When you put an open source library out there, or a piece of code in the world, or whoever wrote that Django documentation that I read on a vacation, 5 years ago, they changed the world in a very interesting and small way. But if that documentation didn't exist, that never would have happened. So the best way that I have to kind of sum this up came from a friend of mine at Python. And she said, I can't say that I'm self-taught. I've been taught by the people who wrote the documentation. Thank you. Time check. All right, does anybody have questions?
In the beginning, I was kind of a rebel against documentation, mainly because I read some books like Clean Code, written by Robert C. Martin and stuff, where they put documentation in a second level. Like documentation can lie to you. It can lie to you and other stuff. Like if it's not updated, you shouldn't rely on documentation. Instead, you should do your code clean and basically make the code.
Beautiful code doesn't need documentation.
Exactly.
I think Brandon covered this yesterday as well, right? Like, that's such a fantastic ideal, but nobody writes code that doesn't need documentation. Like, that is not the real world. But I agree that the culture has been teaching that documentation is not important, it's not valuable, it is out of date. And the hard part is turning that ship, right? And that's what we're trying to do.
So what I wanted to ask you is, I think that rebel, that a small fraction of that rebel is still alive to me. Sometimes I see like documentation for add 2 numbers. When I see a function called add 2 numbers, and I see documentation for that, that rebel kind of revive, like,
so my favorite answer to how to do code comments is comment the why, not the how.
Yep.
It's like, adds 2 numbers. Thanks. All right, but moving on, I saw a couple hands in the back.
Comment on beautiful code doesn't need documentation. Maybe we should turn it around and have beautiful documentation that doesn't need code.
Yeah. There's a lot of code written in the world to address documentation issues, right? Like, it's kind of crazy when people don't know how to use their software, and then you have to, but yeah, I agree.
And seriously, though, the whole, it's something I've been doing thinking about lately. I thought I will touch on this a bit. It's one of the aspects that turning documentation into code is, the whole idea of literal programming is an interesting approach, and you can also maybe deal with the translation.
Yeah, literal programming was a much better idea for software documentation than lot type. Both from the same author.
Hi. Many thanks. Your talk was amazing.
Thank you.
Although Python is not my main day-to-day working language, day-to-day I work with SQL Server and designing a brief course using Cognos in VM. So how read documentation applies to SQL Server queries or code, because I have faced a lot of code without any documentation, principles, triggers, or procedures, but I want to know, how does read documentation apply to SQL Server or any other language?
So how does read the docs work with other languages? So read the docs is basically just a hosting platform for Sphinx. And Sphinx has the concept of a domain, which allows you to represent programming language concepts in different languages. So you can actually document any language. You can document Python, and you can document C# and anything else. Generally, with software that you're actually using, like SQL Server, you just need a user guide, right? You don't actually need documentation of the code. You need documentation of the, what the code is actually doing, how-tos, cookbooks, how to actually operate the software, and that's kind of viewed traditionally as like a user guide, which would just be prose and screenshots for the most part. And so, yeah, that's the beauty of Sphinx is it lets you do API documentation of codes and functions and classes. It also lets you do prose for a user guide, and then it lets you reference them together, which is the really cool part.
I think what he's asking about is actually stored procedures when you have large bodies of code that don't exist in a traditional repo that actually live inside your database.
I mean, you could always just have a repo that's like stored procedures where you document the things. Because yeah, I mean, or you could, no, don't put documentation in the database. All right, 2 more questions. I think you were.
Do you have any suggestions for how to force our users and developers to read the documentation, other than just telling them I get them when they have a question?
So this is why we have rtfd.org. I mean, I think the classic answer to this is when people ask you questions, you reply with links to the documentation. LMGTFY, similar, right? Like, it's like, hey, instead of bothering me, how about you search first in the docs? We've also looked at doing things like Slack integrations, this kind of stuff, to kind of really help people learn themselves. So they're like, hey Steve, how do I do this thing? And you can just be like, /docs, string you just said, and it like returns a search result, right? But yeah, I think it's really just education and just being like, hey, I'm going to beat you over the head with the fact that documentation exists and it's good and we're updating it and it's actually useful. I think.
Yeah, Eric, I'm wondering if you guys are willing to bring the more creative side of writing to some place like Write the Conference, where you can influence the documentation writers, because I think the technical documentation drives people away. It's usually very dry, and I remember this experience because the first manual that I got for Delphi, it was discouraging, totally discouraging. And then I got this book from a guy called Charlie Calvert. It was totally the opposite, because he made the content so much fun. I kept engaged and I went through all the material. So I'm wondering if you guys are considering that kind of stuff, because I think that would be very influential.
Yeah. Sorry Python community, but Ruby actually has the best introductory programming text, which is why it's pointed guide to Ruby. I don't know if people have read it, but it's like, it's art. And so yeah, the question was basically, how do we make technical documentation interesting? And how do you keep people engaged? And it doesn't have to be boring, right? Like, Python's been doing this forever. They use Monty Python examples in all the code snippets, right? Like, making things fun, making things interesting is a huge part of writing good documentation. At the conferences, we've actually had a couple really good talks. One on how to use emoji in documentation. Right? Like how do you, like the internet is changing. We're building things on the internet. We should be able to use, custom, current methods and this kind of stuff. And, just having a big, huge page of text is incredibly off-putting. And yeah, doing images, doing video, doing, all these different things, making it fun, writing it in a style that's conversational and not just like, step one, put the thing in there. I think a huge part of it. And this is why, writing is a fundamentally separate skill than writing code. And most of us are really bad at writing. And I think this is the outcome, right? When you get programmers writing documentation, they really need to practice how to write and make it interesting and have a story and all this kind of stuff. But I think there's still hands, so come find me afterwards because we started a bit late. So thank you all for coming and listening.